All right, looks like we got everyone here. Hello, everyone. My name is Garrett Wong. I'm the Member Services Manager here at the Green Sports Alliance on behalf of our entire Alliance team. Hope you all are staying safe and healthy. Want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. We've got a really fun conversation here lined up with our webinar featuring this conversation of setting the tone, leading sustainability commitments across the sports industry, representation from Waste Management Sustainability Service, University of Southern California, and Prima Professional Cycling. Really excited to kick off this conversation. Want to first thank our team over at LNS Captioning for providing our closed captioning for today's services. More information on how to utilize their service for captioning is within the chat box, and feel free to follow that link on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see all of us on the screen as well, and we'll have this fun little dialogue back and forth. Feel free to toggle the screen in whichever way is best for you all as we dive into the hour. So today's webinar recording, what we're going to be doing is having this emailed to all attendees following the session. And so for Alliance members specifically, you'll have access to the recording of today's webinar and past webinars within our specific member archives on Vimeo. Feel free to contact us at info@greensportsalliance.org for that specific access. But for today's webinar, we'll be sending all of that post event today, later this afternoon. And for those of you that are staying in tune with all the Green Sports Alliance news and things going on, we are having our virtual summit this summer, getting back into that June timeframe of things on Tuesday the 22nd and Wednesday the 23rd. We had some really fun conversations this last fall in October on social justice, environmental sustainability, and DEI conversations, all under the umbrella of the Green Sports Alliance. We hope you all will be able to join us. And if there are folks that want to be specifically in tune, either on a speaker role, a sponsorship side, or just want to stay in tune with more information, feel free to keep an eye out on some communications coming out here in the near future, or feel free to email our team member, Kristen Hanzor, at kristen@greensportsalliance.org. And before we dive in today, we will have some time for Q&A at the end of this conversation, leaving a big chunk of time for some Q&A and discussion here. So feel free to send in some of your live Q&A for all of us. We'd love to dive into some of these conversations that you all would love to, for us to discuss. So looking forward to that. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first speaker for today's webinar. I'll pass it off to Isabella Bertold, who is the sustainability entrepreneur and founder and co-owner of Prima Professional Cycling, a professional cycling, women's cycling team based in Vancouver, BC. As one of our newest members of the Green Sports Alliance, we're excited to hear from Isabella on some of the team's aspirations for becoming a carbon neutral cycling team. Isabella, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. So La Prima Professional Bike Racing, also referred to as InstaFund Racing, out in the sort of the open public space, is in its third year, and it's a full women's professional cycling team, which is sanctioned by the UCI, which is sort of be like the equivalent of the NFL in the cycling world. We are one of 5 teams registered in North America, and there's just over 60 teams internationally. So most of the competition right now is in Europe because of COVID restrictions, but normally global competition based. And we have set a very ambitious goal of trying to be a carbon neutral organization by the end of 2022. And I emphasize on it being very ambitious. And this year is all about our organization learning from people who started this journey ahead of us, and also sharing publicly, though, how we plan to go carbon neutral in 2022. And our theme is radical transparency. So we want to showcase and really share every challenge that we meet along the way, especially when we start to look at our sort of on the scope 3 side of things, working with our manufacturers and suppliers of bicycles, tires, kit, all of that fun stuff. That's really a bit of a high-level overview, and pass it back to Garrett.
Thanks for that, Isabella, and especially when the team reached out to us at the Green Sports Alliance to see where we can dive into these pieces. I mean, especially with the announcement of all of this coming on International Women's Day here in March. I mean, such an incredible story to bring this all together, and we're excited to have Isabella and the rest of the team ingrained into the Green Sports Alliance Members Network. I'll pass it now over to Sam. She is the Managing Director at the University of Southern California, focusing on endowment and asset allocation and risk. In addition, Sam manages the endowment's non-US developed equity and cash portfolios and non-endowment investments. Prior to USC, she was the chair of the risk management committee at PAMCO, where she advised clients on risk and hedge fund investments. Sam, really excited to hear more on some pieces that you're leading, especially with the mid-February announcement of some fossil fuel divestment plans from the university.
Yes, we're super excited at USC, and thank you to Green Sports and Garrett for having us. So the USC is, a premier university in Southern California and across the world. Our endowment is about $7 billion, and we invest in a variety of different types of assets. The sustainability is really important to the university. We have a sustainability office. And as you just mentioned, we had a release about our fossil fuels. We had a policy change. It was really founded on how USC incorporates the 6 unifying values across the university. And part of our fossil fuel policy was to incorporate best practices in stewardship that involve investing. And so those best practices were for us to expand our current stewardship policy, and that as it relates to the endowment, to have adopt a new statement on investment responsibility, and then to establish an ACIR, or an advisory committee on investment responsibility at the university level. And then, as you said, as it relates to the fossil fuel investments, there were 2 larger components to that policy change. The first was a freeze on, to formalize the freeze on new investment fossil fuels, to formalize the freeze on new investments in fossil fuels, and then also to prudently liquidate any positions that we currently have in the portfolio. And we expect that to happen over a period of time. And this, I think, really sort of integrates nicely in with the university's sustainability goals as they relate to, having an overarching plan for the university that includes everything from, the endowment to things like solar panels and recycling. So it really ties all of those values and the whole university together.
Appreciate that, Sam, and especially as more universities and entities start to look at some of these pieces, would really look to some of the Q&A pieces that we've got here on the back end of the webinar to see how other folks can stay engaged in this type of work. And last but not least, I want to pitch it over to Lee Spivak here with Waste Management Sustainability Services as the managing principal of their sports and entertainment team. With over a decade of experience in sustainable business management solutions, Lee's focused on comprehensive environmental programs, sustainability supply chains, and efficiency programs for numerous Fortune 500 companies. I mean, we're talking GHG inventory management, CDP reporting, sustainable sponsorship development. Do I need to keep going, Lee, or maybe should I stop there and pass it off to you?
I don't have anything to add. That was perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you about setting goals. And as Garrett mentioned, Waste Management Sustainability Services had an advisory services team, and we work with a variety of clients on comprehensive sustainability programs. People, come to us for material management and waste diversion, but we do a lot more than that, getting into emissions and water and energy and reporting and certifications and stakeholder engagement, and really trying to build a full program. So I'm excited to talk with you all today about goal setting.
No, absolutely, Lee. And I mean, the main purpose of this conversation today is to look at, this pandemic has really shifted a lot of conversations in terms of sustainability. This year has been really difficult for a lot of organizations, and yet there are still these opportunities that we all see for sustainable progression, especially throughout all of our organizations. And I mean, especially for somebody like Isabella, the team with that announcement, as I alluded to on International Women's Day, of planning to become carbon neutral, that's a big goal. I mean, we all look to these different entities and organizations, whether it's a Climate Pledge Arena or a Waste Management Phoenix Open, of these pieces being very key pillars of sustainability in sport. But for you all, I mean, where did that all kind of start from? Was that a team-based piece? Was that something that you all had discussed internally? Tell us a little bit more about that story behind the goal.
I'll jump in on sort of starting. So cycling is generally viewed as a very environmentally green form of transport. When you start to look at the professional side of the sport and sort of where the role models are on the athlete side, it is far from that. I think that the easiest example is the Tour de France. If you see an aerial shot, there's a pack of about 100 cyclists with about 50 vehicles following them over courses that 150, 180 kilometers a day for 3 weeks. So that alone is just an example of where there can be change. And while individual athletes have started to step up and make pledges themselves, they're really just focused on just offsetting their own personal travel, for example. And I think for the sport to change, it needs to be on an organizational side, and the teams themselves need to step up and start setting ambitious goals. And I think really going back to the important part of us was sharing our learning along the way, because it's one thing to hear somebody make an announcement and say, we want to be carbon neutral, and now we're carbon neutral, but how did anybody actually reach that? And that's something that we want to share along the way. And so I think it's setting an ambitious goal and not being afraid to fail at the goal is part of ours as well. And we've set 2022 as that goal. And if it needs to get pushed back, it will. It's not going to just vanish and disappear from there. But we thought it had to be ambitious to hold ourselves accountable and also our partners to join us on our journey.
Absolutely. And speaking of timelines, I mean, for an entity like USC to have to jump into this isn't a one-day press release that took, a couple of hours to write. This has been a long process in the making. I mean, Sam, from your team, where did it start? How did it all come together? And would love to hear a little bit more on from your perspective on what went into this announcement that you all had.
I think it was really twofold. There's the values piece, which comes from the university as a whole, and then there's the investment piece. And the investment office and specifically the trustees are fiduciaries for the endowment assets. And so we always have to take an investment return and risk lens to whatever we do, and always have that fiduciary mindset as we as staff go look to invest the assets of the endowment. And so from that perspective, there really is this, university-wide, how does this, what are the base, sort of the base values and the unifying values that we have across the university, but also then what are the goals that we want to get to as a university? And that's where the sustainability office really comes into play for the whole university. And then with us within the endowment, looking purely at the risk and return, there are aspects of fossil fuels that are the risk and return trade-off is not the proportions that you would want for a long-lived asset. And using that fiduciary lens is really something that we had the basis of our recommendation. And it really is formalizing what we've already been doing for a number of years within the endowment is within these dedicated fossil fuel investments.
No, that's great to hear. Lee, I mean, you guys have been doing this for a long time. This isn't your first rodeo at diving into zero waste goals or sustainability metrics. I mean, for, I guess, your journey throughout all of this, how do you envision that all of this kind of really started clicking along the way? Was it the partners? Was it the internal backing? I mean, what does a timeline look like for a waste management sustainability service throughout all this?
Yeah, that's a good broad question. So I'd love to kind of start with something that I'm seeing more and more, and where it came from waste management side is that these goals are best set and implemented when they represent your values. And both of the previous panelists mentioned that in Isabella talking about the purpose of this new cycling team, and Sam talking about the values of USC. You know, from an environmental, from a fiduciary point of view, like she said, she's responsible for making sure their investments are sound. So when you can set values, and from the WM side with the Phoenix Open and then my whole team, the existence of my team, we're about helping our own impacts and helping our customers reduce their environmental impact. And that when it really aligns with the purpose of your organization, you see incredible results, more than just kind of setting a goal that's kind of secondary or forced in some way. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say, is that there's been a lot of social goals, social impact goals across sporting organizations for years. And I think those are constantly evolving, prioritizing diversity more than ever in a really wonderful way. But the environmental goals really over the last few years have been an increasing priority. And kind of speaking to the viewers here around how to make that effective, it's about making sure you're incorporating those goals, again, not as a secondary program or an afterthought, but how are they part of your planning process? How are they part of your operations? How are they part of your marketing? So it's when you're having those, you know, most events have a planning team or advisory board or something that set goals and set operational planning in the works. Like, how are you making sure there's a sustainability voice from the beginning in that sense? And when you do, you see these comprehensive programs. It's really great to focus on you know, one or two major goals that are very relevant for you. But if you set up a sustainability program that leaves out water or leaves out emissions or leaves out waste or stakeholder engagement, procurement, any of these elements, it's a risk. You don't want to like be highlighted for one element and then say, well, what are you actually doing for everything? And how are you, and then on top of that, how are you getting diverse perspectives in setting those goals as well as implementing them, making sure you're getting people in different roles, frankly, people from different age groups, because there you see priorities with different age groups and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. You know, you can have a fantastic, smart planning team setting goals for an event or an organization, but you're really not you're not doing it the right way if you're not incorporating diverse perspectives and trying to hit every potential impact that you have. So those are a few things that I've noticed across the industry that we try to incorporate when we're working with our own events or we're working with large, you know, IndyCar races, marathons, conferences. Our events really run the gamut of every type of event stadium you can think of. So we try to take that initial perspective when kind of setting up the goal management process.
And that's a key piece here too. It's not necessarily, as you mentioned, Lee, the what, but it's the why and the how, right? With all of these values and core pieces, it's not necessarily what is the name of our goal and what is that press release going to look like, but it's okay, how are we going to build this team together? Who needs to be engaged in this conversation, as you mentioned, with that diverse team that you need to bring in? And then why are we doing this? Is this for the key value of the community, for our organization? What is that impact going to look like? I mean, this was something I think, Sam, we had talked briefly last week during our prep call for this, but it was, you know, how do you get the community engaged into this, especially with USC touching on so many parts of the LA County region? I mean, for you all, how did you bring that voice into the fold of things at the university as you were building out this plan?
Well, for our the new investment policy, you know, obviously USC has a very diverse constituent base. There's faculty, students, alumni, staff members, just community members at large. And so the way that, and they all have their own ability to, you know, to say, to be public about their views. As it relates to the investment office and the endowment, part of our plan is to create an ACIR, which is the Advisory Committee on Investment Responsibility, And that really is going to be a forum. It's a best practice across stakeholders and across universities. And it will bring together different stakeholder voices. So it will have representation from some of those groups that I mentioned beforehand. And it will be a mechanism and a process for bringing to the forefront issues that constituents in a university would like to bring forth as they relate to the investment side of the endowment. And that's why having a statement on investment responsibility is so important, because things need to rise to that level of the investment responsibility for it to be addressed at that committee. But it really is a way to give voice to the diverse, backgrounds and issues that people would like to bring or would like to make comments on.
And that's a perfect representation of what I was saying about core values. Like the USC is clearly making a mission statement on this, and then that is going to guide decision-making process instead of it just being, again, a secondary concept that's brought in. Like, oh, we should also be sustainable in our investment strategy. It's so key to set that mission statement, to set your sustainability pillars, however you phrase it, that'll end up guiding and making sure people that maybe are not thinking about sustainability are actually incorporating that into their priorities. And it's a mandate from the entire organization, not just like a few individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Isabella, I mean, you all are building this program right now. You're listening to different stakeholders. You're trying to figure out from your current partners and other folks, how all of this is going to change and grow over time. I mean, even in these first couple of months of 2021, what has your team learned? What have you been hearing from sponsors and the community, and how have those conversations changed over even these first 3 months?
Yeah, I think I'll start with just our general community first. It was quite nerve-wracking publishing those first few announcements publicly, going, how is this really going to resonate with our current fan base? And we knew going into it that we were willing to lose existing fans if we had to, because they weren't the ones that we really wanted in the long run. But we were blown away by the positive feedback that we had of people generally thanking us to start having this conversation in a public space within the cycling world. And I think going to suppliers, and for a bike team, suppliers are often sponsors or product development partners. So you're actually helping them build out new product that will be released. And it's really changed the conversation that we're having. It shifted from more of a traditional sponsorship conversation to more of one of how can we work together and how can we learn together. And I think a really interesting thing that's come of it is our bike sponsor is Factor Bikes, and together with us, we're actually starting next week a 6-week long circular economy workshop that's put on for the bike industry specifically, where we are going to learn about their manufacturing process, and they're going to learn with us on what they can do to make their bikes last longer, fit into more of a circular economy, and how they can make their practices more sustainable. So it's really shifted from just what value do we bring for each other on a marketing standpoint to more of how can we build a long-term values aligned relationship as well, which it's been overwhelmingly positive for us.
Absolutely. I mean, the key words here, I mean, even in these first couple of minutes of this session, have been value, positivity, and driving this conversation, especially with this conversation that you all are having, Isabella, of partners and sponsors getting engaged in this conversation. I mean, it's something similarly that we've seen with other teams and colleges across the space, and hopefully this is obviously the trend that we want to grow out into the future outside of this pandemic. Lee, I guess, I mean, from your perspective, the sponsorship and partnership side has always been so key, and I imagine nearly every sustainability goal and metric and kind of activity that you've been engaged in. I mean, where do you see, I know this wasn't necessarily a question that we'd lined up, but in this conversation, where do you see all of that growing and expanding over not just this year, but in many years to come?
I think it's going to be so key. I love this conversation because it's getting exactly what you just asked, which is what's driving this. And at a lot of sporting events, it's sponsors, because that's where money's coming from. Again, the values of a stadium, just going back to what I said before, maybe their top value is to make sure they can operate and they're making money. That's like how a stadium exists. So for a stadium to then also put sustainability as a priority next to that, they're going to have to figure out a way to make it economically viable, and sponsorships are driving that. For the WM Phoenix Open, we talked to the host committee, the host group, the Thunderbirds, who's a fantastic partner to work with in this, because they put on the tournament, and we said we wanted to take trash cans off the course in 2012, and that was, it was a hard thing. It's kind of what Isabella said. It wasn't just, oh, this will definitely work, we'll nail this, 100% not a problem. That's not how valid goal setting works. It's supposed to be a bit of a challenge. Otherwise, it's just your typical operation. So I see sponsorships driving this. I think sponsors want to be associated, want to put their name, it's not just logo placement anymore, they want to put their brand on something that there's a story to it, there's something that they care about. So if you're like, I think all organizations right now should be measuring and reducing their greenhouse gas footprint, with goals. Ideally 2022 is fantastic. A lot of organizations are looking at 2025, 2030, and how you do that involves all of your partnerships, involves some financial incentives, because being responsible can cost more money in some cases. We get that question a lot of like, what's the ROI on this? And we can answer that pretty well, but the other ROI is that you're being responsible and there's a cost, and that's just how it works. I'd also love to add that I think sponsors can help make these commitments more authentic. That, Isabella said something that one of my favorite phrases when people are talking about carbon neutrality, scope 3, she said that in her introduction, because oftentimes that's left out, where people are looking at their direct operational impacts, their scope 1, their indirect power usage, their scope 2, because those are the easiest to understand. You get utility bills, you get fuel usage data, it can be estimated if it's not directly there in front of you. Scope 3 is the stuff you're buying, the hospitality structures you're building, the gifts you're purchasing, the third-party transportation, the Sam's investments, like what an organization invests in is part of its scope 3 footprint. So maybe a specific event doesn't have an investment structure, but most organizations have some investment structure, and it's really key to incorporate that. And I'm seeing more sponsors saying we want this to be real and authentic and not just a greenwashing fluff piece. And to do that, you have to really commit to, true environmental objectives, which, that's why we're here talking about this. It's what we all want to prioritize.
And I think as it relates to the endowment, setting goals and having partners, it's, we have those things in our world, and they more align with, again, what I was saying earlier around having a fiduciary mindset and thinking in terms of risk and return and generating, returns for the endowment, but doing in a very thoughtful and knowing what your risks are at all times. And so incorporating ESG into our investment policy and making sure that we have a stewardship policy that is part of the way that we go about investing, and that we incorporate that into all of the investments that we make. So, we do look at the E, the S, and the G when we make different, when we make our investments. And it's not only in terms of, is there going to be return generated, but is that also a mitigant, risk mitigant on to a specific investment? And so you have to use that lens on both sides to be able to make sure that you're getting the best risk-adjusted return for the endowment.
Absolutely. I mean, these buzzwords of ROI, financial sustainability, triple bottom line, they're always going to be a part of these conversations, right? And especially as Lee and Sam, you both were kind of illustrating, it's making sure it aligns with the value, but also making sure it's going to keep a sustainable progression for the organization, for the team, and the program moving forward. But I mean, especially for each of your organizations as they're growing and adjusting through these times, I mean, throughout all of these commitments, have you seen any other, major voices or conversations that are shifting things in one direction or another? This is just kind of an open question to the whole panel. I mean, is this something that you see is continuing to accelerate over time? Is this something that's just kind of just receiving more general input from, as you mentioned, Sam, community stakeholders and sponsors and other folks, but where is this all kind of changing in terms of direction right now?
I think it's changing, especially in sport, because of organizations' non-environmental goals and their marketing goals as well. So like we've been talking to a few organizations recently that really want to focus on youth engagement because they want to grow their sport. So that's one of their core goals. And so if you're looking at ROI or you're looking at financial sustainability, the number of youth engagement efforts and the results of that, of engaging more, probably kids under 18 in at least one of these cases, is a huge focus for them. That's part of their ROI. And again, in sports, on top of things like that, it's the marketing value. We're talking about an industry that sort of has unparalleled marketing capacity when you're talking about the reach and the TV and online viewership. It's really key to make sure that's part of your analysis and you're not just saying, oh, well, we put more, people in the seats. That's definitely a goal, but you should be looking at how you're getting earned media from other brands and how many more clicks you're getting and what kind of stories you're telling, because those are important priorities, not just these like basic metrics. So I guess I'm seeing more and more of that for these long-term conversations of, what's important to us and what are we acting on and how are we making sure it pays off. It's really happening across organizations that we're consulting with.
I think for us, there's sort of tipping my hat to the metrics, side of what Lee just said. There is a recognition across the world that different types of ESG metrics should be kept track of effectively. And so we're seeing that across the world in different ways. It could be something like the Federal Reserve Bank, having sort of a new policy stance on in climate change and the risks associated with it in terms of financing. It could be the Accounting Standards Board requiring companies to make public different types of ESG metrics within their corporate releases and their financial statements or audited financial statements. So I think we see it in a variety of different ways that all relate to the business and finance of investing.
I think on within the cycling space and in the sports space, I would say there's just tremendous momentum going right now, and I think I don't see why it would stop now that people are starting to work more together, and also the collaboration in this space I think is quite phenomenal and more than what I've seen in other areas. And I think what makes it a little bit more special also for our bike team specifically is just working within the women in sports space as well. Cycling is a sport where it's still quite male dominant in terms of TV time, minimum salaries, and all of prize money and all of that space. And so I think what this has opened the door for our athletes as well is to have conversations with people more than just what they're doing on the bike. So not just how quickly they went up the mountain, but more what they're doing off the bike as well. And so it's changed the landscape, and I think the more that people can have conversations within the women in sports space beyond just the sport that they're competing in, again, I think it'll just keep going. And sort of going back to what Lee said of just on the sports side and on the arena side, there's sponsorship pressure as well, and everything is just, I think the timing right now is really good, and I think a lot of progress is going to be made over the next 10 years.
Oh, absolutely. And this isn't just to speak of the power of sport here in this conversation. It's the power of the athlete voice as well, Isabella, with you and the team, especially as you're driving all of this, or I guess riding through all of this. It's certainly, so it's just so impactful to see the power that comes with an athlete talking about some of these issues, some of these aspirations, and being able to hear that from yourself and others on the team, I think is just it carries so much weight to it. And I think especially as we've seen so many other instances throughout this past year of athletes speaking out on certain injustices or being able to talk about other areas that they're passionate about, from coaches, players, other alumni, and pieces like that, it's going to drive a lot of these conversations moving forward. And Lee, as you're talking about the future of sport for a lot of these organizations, that youth component is another incredibly impactful area that folks are driving towards, especially in some of their long-term sustainability goal plans here in the next couple of years. And I want to kind of drive into this piece as well, as we're starting to talk about just we've really been, thinking on the future goals and what we all are trying to plan for down the road, how we can attain these, but maybe even shifting, and this is a conversation and question that just came in through the live chat, but thinking about the now, like what are your organizations doing today, tomorrow, and this week to drive towards some of these larger goals? Would love to keep that open-ended and however y'all want to answer that, but would love to hear a little bit more on what your organizations are doing today and in the present tense to reach some of these larger aspirations that your organizations have.
Yeah, for me, we help a lot of large and small organizations with an organization and impact benchmarking process. So that's for even if you're slow, even if you don't have full staff, this is the thing you can get started on right now, no matter how big you are. And I say operational benchmarking too, because 2020 and 2021 are weird years from an impact baseline process. So you might not be able to say, okay, well, here's our typical usage of this fuel. But what you can do is make a list of all the sources of the fuel and set up protocols to capture that information. So when you do get back to what might be considered more typical operations, you have a whole system set up to make sure you're tracking your footprint. It's also what we've all talked about, which is how do you embed this in your operations and incentivize sustainability, not just a side program. A lot of organizations, they have a sustainability person, but that person doesn't have a role in planning or have enough authority to give feedback when things are not being sustainable. So how do you set up the organization and then the data management? Even if it's not your perfect footprint for 2021, every organization should be trying to measure their environmental footprint, focusing on emissions and water and waste and other metrics that are important to them, and creating those protocols for data management. I will say that that can be hard to do without an expert that has that kind of perspective. It's really great when organizations can just do that themselves, but to get it off the ground, it often requires someone with that kind of experience. And if you're talking to consultants, as it being deeply in that field, obviously, any consultant that's selling you on, oh, you're going to need me for the next 10 years, they're probably not thinking about your financial goals the right way. You probably need a sustainability person in your organization at some point, but to get it off the ground, it can really be helpful hiring someone with the right experience that's going to, prioritize what you need and get you kind of set off in the right direction.
Sam, Isabella, anything else on what your organizations are doing at present?
Yeah, we're definitely, I'm gonna call it the tear down phase right now, where we are taking apart every single part of our operations and working through with the consultant actually to really map everything out and understand where we are and what changes need to be made for next year. And with that, also learning really what's happening on our supplier side. How is the clothing made that our athletes are wearing? What's that process like? What are other companies doing that we could work with that's different instead, and how does that compare? So really doing a deep dive on their end as well. And then whenever we come across something that an athlete can make a change right away, and it can be literally as simple as how they're packaging their food that goes into their bike jersey when they're out on a training ride. Any change that can be made right away, we are making, and we're trying to share that through our social channels and sort of just educating on the little changes that every single person can make in their day-to-day. And then we will be sharing all of that in the fall, sort of our big, the unpacking of our organization and a very honest and open audit, essentially, of where we are and what's going to change in 2022 for us to reach our goals.
I think for
exactly what I was talking about, just to emphasize that point, like deconstructing your organization, saying here's where we can make an impact, and setting up a plan for each one of those areas. That's how you set a goal that, and you know you can achieve it. So I think that's such a valuable lesson for organizations that are listening of any size.
Yeah, I think for us, like we have, you know, like what are we doing right now? I mean, the things that I sort of went over in the you know, very beginning, the intro, those are the things that we're doing right now, and they are university policy, either in process or things that we've already announced. But I think, you know, from those are very macro type of issues. You know, they're university policy, they're you know, our guiding documents and principles. But then there's things on the very micro level, and that can be something as simple as when we go to make a new investment, you know, how do we think about mitigating risks of ESG? You know, so if we are potentially making some sort of real estate investment, what type of climate impact could it have in the future? Or, you know, is there sort of a social or governance aspect that we should really be thinking more critically and really delving into deeper for each of those investments? And again, it really is having a fiduciary mindset of looking at the risk and return for each of those investments.
Absolutely. No, I love to hear just these conversations right now, because these goals aren't necessarily just a press release and then you sit and wait on it and then you start doing the work. It's a daily process of how you're going to be able to build all these pieces out, especially with this tear down the walls mentality, Isabella, that your team's bringing in, and especially for Sam and you and the rest of the team, as you start to look at specifically where all of these investments are going to, the implications behind it, this ESG mentality that you're having here, I think is just such a strong piece to have. As Lee mentioned, you know, you need to have that type of emphasis in everything that you're doing, not just necessarily just having a sustainability piece secondary to everything else that you're doing, but making it a core pillar of everything that's ongoing. I want to transition here to this question that we've been getting in a couple of times actually from folks on the live questionnaire side. And it's going back to that conversation that we had about the sponsor and partnership side of things. I mean, as you mentioned, Isabella, there are going to be folks in the area and the space that are going to, you know, stay the course with you all, that are going to bring in that positive feedback, and that are going to want to even further invest and be a part of this mission and vision that InstaFund Racing and La Prima Pro Cycling are bringing in here. But there are also going to be partners and sponsors that you are either locked in with or wanting to see where they can change some of their ways. And some of that may not be one of their most important initiatives, at least for their organization. I mean, especially for your team, Lee, for you as well. I mean, what are some of these ideas and conversations that you're having with these sponsors and partners, and how are you able to kind of get them to align with some of your own sustainability actions and long-term sustainability goals?
Yeah, I think part of our timing and planning of everything was a little bit strategic around when sponsorship contracts do expire on our end. So most of ours, we have the flexibility to make changes at the end of this year to meet our goals. And there's definitely a risk involved. Like losing a sponsor, that's very important, could be detrimental to the organization. But I think that's a risk you have to be willing to take. And working with people that are values aligned is so important. And it not only makes it more enjoyable working with them, but you do accomplish greater things. And ultimately, I think the relationships are more positive for both people on a financial return side of things as well, if the sponsorship relationships are values aligned. And in the meantime, I think there's always ways of bringing people in, and a very, very basic for Earth Day. All of our riders are leading garbage pickup rides in their area. So they're going out on their favorite training ride, bringing bags with them and picking up trash along the way. And we've invited all of our sponsors to join us on that. So even if maybe they're not able to make a change on their manufacturing side, or it's just not a priority for them, they're generally, the feedback we've had is there's people on their teams that want to participate in that and join in on something as simple as a garbage pickup ride. So you can still always find ways to reach out and understand what they can do and sort of connect with them on a different level than necessarily on the bigger side of going carbon neutral with us, because definitely that doesn't work for everybody. It's not a priority for everyone, because there's different avenues for companies to go down for sure.
Yeah, I basically every project we have, we do this sponsorship analysis, and it's existing sponsors and what their services are. Sometimes it's a product, sometimes it's a service, and you can almost always find a sustainability initiative that they can either support or is directly related to what they're doing. So if you feel like that's not the case, I would really recommend that organizations think that through a little bit, because there are existing sponsorships where, again, these brands, speaking from one of those brands, people know Waste Management. This little logo right here. People that don't know us know us. It's like, it's totally wild. So our focus is more about, you know, how do we showcase that we are committed to sustainability? So when we put that on a football stadium, they can come to us and say, well, here's some initiatives that you can help with. So I think there's so many opportunities, if it's in the tech sector, food service, the apparel, there's so many targets that you can set where a sponsorship can create a new goal and specifically drive the implementation towards that goal. I also think there's been some news recently around sponsorships that are, funded by companies with huge greenhouse gas footprints. I don't want to totally ignore that because it's been in the news quite a bit. I think that and the reverse element of sponsorships is that organizations can make these sponsor organizations think about their own operations. So from the Phoenix Open, for example, when we started that zero waste initiative in 2012 and we hit 97% diversion, that was really impactful for our employees and their customers across the company. So seeing that sponsorship and what's possible at a golf tournament for 700,000 people or more in some years that has a construction build out for 8 months, that's all zero waste. That it makes people feel like, some people are kind of scared, like, oh, we can't do that. But it's such a scale that it kind of makes me feel like anybody can do it if they put the right emphasis on it. We've done it at other golf tournaments and conferences and various types of events. We've written roadmaps for people to get there in the next few years. It creates a mentality within the sponsoring organization that's incredibly valuable and is going to lead to the type of industry shift that we all need to see. And I think if you don't have, Isabella mentioned the existing sponsors, every organization can create new sponsorships. You should have an energy sponsor. You should have a zero waste sponsor. You should have a carbon neutrality sponsor. You can, whatever your goals, you can create that avenue where it can be some financial incentive for your organization, but also it can lead to an initiative that everyone wants to talk about. And then we're going back to that earned media conversation where the sponsors and the organizations are just pumped up because they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars of earned media because other companies are talking about their initiatives. So we could have a whole session just on sponsors. I think it's really something that every sports organization should take a hard look at, because there's incredible opportunities and the existing ones are often not being optimized.
No, absolutely. And Leah is somebody that's attended many Waste Management Phoenix Opens in my day as a ASU graduate myself. Sorry for the Pac-12 rivalry, Sam, but it's okay. Our athletics are not that great these past couple of years. Just the impact that you all have been able to make for some of those fans, that perspective that you bring into that. And that's driven primarily from that sponsorship side and from the organization's perspective, and being able to drive that for the community and from the community, as you mentioned, Sam, earlier. I think that kind of two-way street of make sure you're listening and acting on all of the pieces that you're able to drive here is so important. And I want to bring this back to Sam, some of the conversations that you had about how other universities can have some of these driving mission statements to pull along all of these conversations, to have that community-based committee in bringing this all together. For other universities, we've seen Pitt, University of Michigan, other major, larger schools driving into this kind of divestment conversation as well. But for some of these smaller colleges on the D3 and even smaller organization side, where do you see opportunities for them to foster some of this growth in these areas of sustainability and divestment strategies?
I think it starts with knowing your constituents and knowing your investment pool and what problem you're trying to solve and what utility function you're trying to maximize. So, for it's kind of a matrix of all of those different things. I mean, if you're a small school and you have an outsourced CIO model, then you have to really engage with that outsourced CIO about the types of due diligence that they're doing on their managers, what their policy statements are, what their practices are around sustainability. If you're potentially a larger school, you probably have an in-house investment office staff like we do. And we're the ones who were making those, doing that analysis and engaging with managers and each of the different investments on a deeper, within these deeper conversations. It's a different, as Isabella and Lee both said earlier, it can lead you to a slightly different type of relationship. And we've always had ESG as part of the questions that we ask because it is a risk mitigant, but it gives you a different take, a different conversation that you have. It could lead you to a potentially different place. And I think that is relevant no matter the size of the endowment and no matter how many investment staff or where the investments are housed within the university. You can have these types of conversations about looking at your office, looking at yourself internally, but then also looking externally to the managers that you're using, the service providers that you have for your staff or for your investments, and then the underlying investments themselves.
I love that perspective of making sure you look internally before you start driving that external conversation. I mean, Lee, from your perspective, not necessarily on the divestment side, but of course on the sustainability and sports end, how do you see other smaller teams, these D3 colleges, other entities really jumping into this to drive some of this? Is it on the sponsorship side that we've been diving in? Is it on the value side that we mentioned earlier, or is it all one and the same? Or is there other pieces of this that we haven't talked about?
It's a great question. I feel like we get that a lot from smaller organizations that don't have the resources to say, what can we do with this? And it goes back to something I said earlier where, we're not, this conversation isn't getting into the doom and gloom of the climate crisis, but we can say that sports plays a massive role in getting to where we need. We need all organizations to prioritize sustainability regardless of their size. And it starts no matter where you're at with that. And Isabella and Sam have talked about this, looking at your operations and your priorities as well as your impacts. It really, when you do that, you outline your areas of success and your stakeholders. And when you measure that across your impacts, it's not easy to make a plan, but it's a lot easier to see the direction you're supposed to go in and see what Isabella mentioned. Here are some quick things we can do right now. Here are some things that we're going to do over the next 12 months. When you lay it all out there, anyone that understands your organization, which everyone listening knows their own organization better than any consultant they'll bring in. When you lay all that out, the next steps you want to make are kind of obvious. So that's really what I think every organization needs to start to do is really outline everything they're doing and all of their impacts. And then from there, it's some of these other points that we're talking about is how do we make this economically viable? How are we using sponsorships? How do we make sure every stakeholder group is included? How are we talking to our student athletes and our professors and our athlete-like organizations within the universities? It's really key to lay all, like I'm repeating myself now, but just to lay all that out, because then you know what to do next. These organizations that try to say, okay, well, here's a goal we're going to tackle first. It might be the right idea, but you might be missing something entirely or figuring out an implementation process that's you're not even considering because you didn't really reflect on everything you're doing. So I just think no matter where any organization's at, that's something they can prioritize over the next 6 to 12 months. And it just demonstrates a lot of value and important commitment.
I think just to add also for the smaller organizations, going back and just being focused on collaboration. Like ask somebody else within your space, maybe how they've already solved a problem or who they've talked to and what they're looking at doing. And using resources from each other and learning from one another, I think is just also so important when you are a slightly smaller organization. And I mean, we've reached out to much larger groups and I've never been turned away or told, no, we're not helping you, that's top secret. Everybody wants to help and towards this because they know that everyone needs to be aligned for real change to happen.
This is all fantastic, and it's amazing to me how time can fly when you're just having this amazing conversation about sustainability commitments over time. And we are 5 minutes towards the hour and would love to continue this as long as we can. But I want to make sure that we can get some final words from all three of you to our audience today. I mean, we get attendees from major universities to sports entities, leagues, and other athletes across our space. I mean, from your own perspectives, perhaps I'll start with Sam. Any last kind of remarks or pieces of advice that you'd want to give to the audience as they're tuning in today?
Well, I do think that, you know, for us, this starts with the university and the values that we bring as a university. And then within the endowment, it really comes down to having a fiduciary mindset and thinking about the impacts that we have with our risk and return, and how does the sustainability mindset fit into those goals that we have, very long-term goals for the endowment. And being a Trojan, I have to say, fight on.
Absolutely, absolutely. It wouldn't be a GSA webinar unless we had a little bit of some sports rivalry and banter here and there. But Lee, anything else that you want to mention here? I know you've got, you know, all these different areas and topics that we've dove into today, but any last kind of remarks or pieces that you wanted to touch on before we sign off?
I think I'd say that I think a lot of people feel helpless when talking about the climate crisis. I think they say, what can I do? And it's really, on an individual level, there are absolutely steps you can take, but it doesn't feel like it's the scale, but the scale that you want. But the people that are listening to this panel right now, you're part of organizations that have a large footprint and a much larger impact than any one individual. So figure out a sustainability program. Even if you're just getting it started, you're just doing the baselining efforts, I can't emphasize how important that is because it lays out the value chain. You know, Sam said something about understanding your constituents earlier. That's key to sell that up the chain and to your boss's boss's boss. So getting something off the ground, making sure you're the person who's driving that at your organization, that's what you can do as an individual. And we really need to see more of that. Whether or not you're hiring a consultant like us or not, we want to see more organizations prioritizing sustainability. It's the change that we're all a part of and we all want to see.
Yeah, I think I'll just add a little bit more on sort of building what Lee says. And like we're brand new in our journey relative to other people on this, and so we are going to be sharing what we're learning. And I think if people have questions about what we're going through and what we're learning in our process, please reach out. And I think just the more transparency as well that everyone can have, the more we'll all learn from one another in this process.
Absolutely. And the way that we talk about it at the Green Sports Alliance is that everybody's on their sustainability journey. It's not just a matter of the pace you're going at or where you are along that journey, but especially as long as you're continuing to progress forward, that's success to us. And absolutely in any way that we can support all of you. It's been great hearing from all of these individual stories all coming together on sustainability commitments, and want to thank all of you for tuning in today and for the rest of our audience for chiming in with your questions and engaging with us. This was a really fun conversation. In the interest of time, would like to just sign off today, say thanks from the Green Sports Alliance and the rest of our network for tuning in, and thank you to all of our speakers for providing your leadership on this webinar today. So we'll sign off for now and we'll connect again at another time, but thanks everyone. We'll tune in again soon.